Good evening. I'd like to call the special joint meeting of the City Council and our planning and City Council City of Marysville and the Marysville Planning and Historic Commission to order today, Tuesday, February 19th at 5:30. Roll call, please.
Mr. Simmons?
Here.
Mr. Buttacavoli?
Here.
Ms. McKenzie? Here. Mr. Hudson?
Here.
Mr. Samayoa?
Here.
Mr. Payne?
Here.
Mr. Nault?
Here.
Ms. Rich Creek? Here. Mr. Vaughn?
Here.
Mr. Bramer?
Here.
Mr. Belza?
Here.
Mr. Deal?
Thank you. We have one item for discussion and a presentation, and then we'll adjourn to our regular meeting, hopefully sometime between 6 and 6:30 for those folks who are waiting for the meeting, the regular City Council meeting. Presentation is of our general plan update. There'll be an introduction by our City Manager, Ms. Brown. Ma'am?
Good evening, Honorable Mayor, Council members, and Planning Commissioners. Thank you for joining us this evening for this special study session regarding a general plan update. The logic or reasoning for tonight's presentation is to really start the conversation about what is a general plan and why do we have it and what's the vision of a general plan, and some of the status of the city's current 30-plus-year-old general plan, as well as some thoughts and ideas on costs and funding strategies to update the city's general plan. So we wanted to start that dialogue prior to the new fiscal year and kind of introduce the conversation with both the council and the planning commission. So with that, I'm going to hand the reins over to Jim Bermudez, the Community Development Director.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Actually, I'm going to turn it over. We're going to break this up in two parts. So first, two parts, it'll be handled by the Assistant Community Development and Services Director, Steve Prosser, and then I'll do parts 3 and 4. So Steve will be up first for the first two sections.
Good evening, Honorable Mayor, members of City Council, and members of the Planning and Historic Commission. The Community Development and Services Department is pleased to be able to present to you a discussion on the general plan update. It's a very important endeavor that we are looking forward to facilitating. So for this presentation, it's broken into 4 parts. I'll be providing you the first 2. What is a general plan and why is it important? And then Director Bermudez will finish the presentation with the update process and what seems to be the most important thing, costs and timeline. So what is the general plan? Well, the general plan has been described as many different things. One of the most common is it's a roadmap. It is where a jurisdiction sees themselves at some point in the future. It's also been considered a constitution, a local constitution for a specific area. It's not exactly a term I would utilize for this other than it's a limited term constitution. It's the concept of a local jurisdiction identifying some point in the future what they want to be, what they want their vision of the community, what their growth, how they see success at a certain point in the future, and then the roadmap on how to get there from our current conditions. Our current general plan was adopted in 1985. It had a vision to 2005. So at the policies and the goals in that general plan had an end point of 2005. So again, general plan, roadmap to the future. It's the limited constitution. It identifies where we are going for growth and development. It identifies and presents the city's common vision on of who we are, where we have been, and what we want to be. Desired outcomes for certain areas, development, economic development, physical development, public services, public safety, and it balances, it's a balancing document. It balances growth with conservation of open space and improvement of quality of life. So there are some guidelines. The state of California has some general plan guidelines. All cities and counties in the state of California are required to adopt the general plan. There were 7 mandatory elements until this last general plan guideline update. They consist of land use, which identifies existing land uses and where we want things to grow and where we want things to establish, businesses, houses, offices, public structures, including police stations, fire stations. The noise element, which is to identify what level of noise in the area is satisfactory and what levels are not, and how we create development that we do not put in places where there are noise issues. For sensitive, what are called sensitive receptors are the elderly, children, those that we want to make sure are in the neighborhoods that are not subject to loud noise. Circulation is transportation. It's how people get around the city, both the vehicular and alternative modes of transportation, including public transit. Housing focuses on our housing stock and our future needs as determined by the city, the citizens, and the state of California. Housing and community development through the regional housing needs assessment and ultimately our housing element that gets updated every 8 years, where we have a certain amount of housing we have to provide safety, both public safety, including fire and police, but also seismic, wildfires, flooding control, all components of our public safety for our citizens. Open space, how we identify how much open space we feel is necessary in the city, how much to improve or continue our quality of life, and conservation of natural resources, including open space areas that are more for passive recreational use than our active recreational uses. There are a potential for a general plan can have optional elements, and what we can discuss there is that it's not set in stone that you have these set mandatory elements that are found in blue. Any jurisdiction can add other elements or chapters of things that are very important to the citizens at large. Some of those are air quality, economic development, healthy communities, focusing on our youth and education, community design, how everything is integrated together, and water resources. I do want to mention that one of the circles I have up there is environmental justice, and although it's colored blue as a mandatory item, it's mandatory for cities that have been identified as disadvantaged communities. So a city or jurisdiction, city or county that goes forward with a comprehensive general plan update must include environmental justice as either an independent chapter in the general plan or incorporate them in all of the other 7 mandatory elements. And when doing that, it triggers that air quality must be looked at, not as a separate chapter, but in relationship to environmental justice. So it's somewhat of a domino effect. Once the housing element, once a general plan is updated, there are certain new mandatory elements that need to be added, and then that triggers additional review and analysis, primarily to focus on disadvantaged communities and the impact of development on that population. The city of Marysville in 1985 adopted a general plan with 7 elements or chapters: land use, which is traditional, discussing where uses can occur, where we would prefer them to go in the future. We have an open space conservation and recreation element. One thing a general plan can do is combine mandatory elements into one, because everything is interrelated. Land use is impacted by transportation, which is impacted by noise, which is impacted by housing. So you can combine those. There will be combined in concept at each chapter, but there is an opportunity that some things can be bundled. Traditionally, land use and circulation is bundled because of the close relationship of the roadway system with uses and getting people to and from uses. Circulation, scenic highways, so circulation, or it was the traffic component of it. We had an optional component of it as scenic highways. There was a concern in 1985 to ensure our scenic highways. Housing, a mandatory element. It's the only element of this time that has to be updated by a set period. Our housing element must be updated by August of 2021. It's an 8-year cycle. It's mandated by the state, and we need to, the process has begun. It's approximately a 2-year process to update the housing element, and it starts from housing and community development down through SACOG, then to us to implement their findings. Community safety and seismic safety, which is the safety element, noise, and then the city of Marysville had an optional redevelopment element. Although redevelopment has dissolved as of 2012, we do have the redevelopment element. That is a great opportunity to have that evolve into an economic development element, kind of moving forward from redevelopment to the new future of how do we sustain our community. So what we have now is the 1985 general plan, which had was a revisioning document, which had a timeline to 2005. So this is our present condition and what we have analyzed, our analysis and our implementation that we believed in 1985 was going to come to fruition in 2005. Now this document is, although limited term constitution, it's a living document. It just means that we had set a date, we had strived to reach the goals to that date, but then you come forward the next time and you look out further and then you kind of reset and you look at what now is the goals, visions, and policies that we want to, as a city, bring forward to the next data point. So in 1985, it was traditional that they had a 20-year lifespan. Most jurisdictions had their general plan as a 20-year document. Once you hit 2005, those documents are now 30 to 50-year documents they're looking forward. So we've added additional information that's necessary to create the plan, but they have looked at a larger timeline because of everything that needs to be done. So our future, potentially, probable environmental justice, conservation, open space, safety, housing, circulation, noise, all the standard elements, and then those that us as a city feel are important and what we would need to strive for the future, whatever timeline we set as a community. So what are the contents of a general plan element? Well, again, an element is a subsection or chapter of the general plan, and each one now is very specific on what it needs to provide to the city. And an introduction, description of element and purpose. So what is the element? Why is it important? What's the purpose of the element? Land use, for example, the purpose of that is logical growth and sustainable growth of a community. Existing conditions, so we inventory how we are sitting today, and then what do we strive for? Where do we want development to occur in the city? Do we want to expand our borders? Do we want to focus on an area downtown that may have an opportunity to include residential with our commercial to try to revitalize or vitalize the area? Policies, how do we get there? What kind of incentives, what kind of regulations, what kind of identified citywide policies to achieve that objective? And then implementation measures. How do we ensure success and how do we measure success for when we look at it the next time? How do we know we've got there in a manner that the city, the citizens want us to? So why is the general plan important? One, our current plan is, again, was adopted in 1985. The visioning documents and the goals and policies for that document assume that what would be considered a build-out date or end date of 2005, where those policies, as far as we looked in the future, to identify what our needs were and how to get there. State law changes. The SB 1000 has, again, required the environmental justice policies as a separate element are integrating throughout the document. For disadvantaged communities, it's an opportunity for us to focus on a specific demographic. Regulations, there's housing elements. Again, the housing element is updated every 8 years. For a long period of time, charter cities were exempt from a significant amount of reporting and state requirement regarding general plans. Traditionally in general law cities and counties, that there was annual reporting and benchmarks and check-ins with the state and its legislator, and each individual new law had a new type of trigger, a new type of reporting. Well, for a very long time, charter cities did not have to do that. They were exempt from it until 2018. when the housing bill started coming forward. And they wanted to make sure that even charter cities now are held to a standard of reporting for the housing crisis and housing development. So as of 2018, providing that annual report on our general plan, on our housing element, how we're meeting our regional housing need goals, how we're implementing policies in our general plan to facilitate housing and community design. Again, a mandatory element updates, housing element in 2021. Safety element has a quasi timeline for update of 2022. It basically triggers if you do a housing element and one other element anytime between 2022 and the future, you trigger a full review of the general plan. There's a standard. The state is concerned about making sure that we have an up-to-date safety element. And then finally, why update? The document is 34 years old, and there's a high probability that the city's vision has changed. And how do we, as a community, how a staff, provide the direction, provide the opportunities that the community wants and needs for development without a current roadmap on how to get there? There's significant updates in improvements in design, construction, development, alternative modes of transportation, many policies, many goals, many practices that we can implement to bring that higher quality of life that we believe the city of Marysville should have and deserve. So what I wanted to show today is a short example of how things change, how elements change, how ideas and how policies and goals change through the years since our general plan was adopted. So this is a small component of our safety element. It talks about only fire and police protection. So when in 1985, when we analyzed and looked towards our future of 2005, we have determined that all areas of the city of Marysville are adequately served at this time. Even in the event of 100% development, all land area of the city, the present fire station should be adequate. That was our goal. For police protection in the planning area, which is the city jurisdiction at the time in 1985, is provided by the Marysville Police Department in the city and Yuba County in the unincorporated areas. We have a police department. In 1992, again, we're looking at example jurisdictions of what is the changing of times when communities are looking at goals and policies and looking at how do we identify our needs, how do we identify our growth, how do we identify what we want and deserve in the future. So now you have goals and policies set forth in 1992 that talks about we want certain type of response times, and this is how we're going to get it. We want this kind of locational criteria for our police and our fire, and this is how many people we want, this is how fast we want them to get there, and this is the training we want them to have. And in 2010, similar, looking at a goal, we want to make sure high level of fire and police protection. How do we meet minimum training requirements? How do we require new development to pay their fair share to ensure that we do not dip below our needs in police and fire? So again, as you get closer and closer to today's date, and as cities evolved and as general plans evolved, the analysis and data and goals and policies became more concrete, more measurable, and so easier for us as a city to report back whether we can attain it or not. So ultimately, to everyone in the city of Marysville, how does it affect you? General plan determines how a city is going to grow in size. How you and your neighbors can develop and use your property, whether for the public good or private property. How is it easy to get your jobs and services? Do we have an appropriate, adequate transportation system? Are there improvements that need to be made? How do we make them? When do we make them? And what ultimately do we want to see citywide and ultimately, hopefully, in future growth areas? How long do you sit in traffic? Again, transportation, circulation, number of jobs and types of jobs, and where the jobs are, the look and feel, the design of the community, our identity, who we are, and who we want to be in the future. Number and quality of parks available. What is the appropriate number? More or less? What types of parks? It builds into the concept of the parks master plan, but that is a subcomponent of the open space element and the public services component of the general plan. This helps guide us to that future. How we are going to identify the risks for environmental hazards and how we're going to respond to those hazards. How do we ensure that we can minimize or mitigate those impacts? For example, seismic hazards. How do we address buildings that may not be to seismic code today, but sometime in the future we'll need to address on reinforced masonry buildings? What's our goals and policies on those types of buildings? Is there something we can do to ensure a higher safety factor? And then how cultural and natural resources around you are preserved or conserved. So again, our identity, both historic and cultural identity, how do we preserve it? How do we conserve it? How do we promote it? And how do we continue it for that time period? So implementation, I have to finish my discussion on general plans with the implementation. It's only effective if implemented. It's goals and policies. Without goals and policies, it's hard for a city or a jurisdiction, a council, or staff to know where we're going without goals and policies on how to get there. Implementation programs must be specific, that is easily understandable, flexibility so that it is a living document. There are opportunities to amend. You do not want a rigid general plan. You produce a to-do list. How are we going to get to where we want to be? And how do we monitor and track so that we know that we're on track and we know that we're doing what the citizens and what the city has determined is the vision of Marysville. And now I'm going to hand this over to the Director Bermudez for the update process.
Good evening, Honorable Mayor, council members. So picking up where Steve left off on this part 3 and where we're headed in a direction, I think a couple of high points just to go back to Steve's great presentation is just getting your arms around the fact that we have a general plan that basically is essentially a walled general plan, which means it expired in a way, I mean, if you really think about it. And in my tenure here, I've heard a lot of great ideas: economic development, infrastructure, safety, and community design, and land use. And when, in my experience and gone back to hear all these different kind of great ideas, in my experience, I usually go back, as Stephen can attest, we go back to the general plan, and it's a laundry list of everything that we're hearing that syncs up to my council members and my planning commissioners. And it is kind of unfortunate in a way where we have a dated plan. It kind of hit that shelf life, and we're kind of trying to find a little bit of an analogy of the North Star. We're trying to get there, but now this is kind of where we're at as staff to finally get there and move it forward. In conversations with staff internally, it's been a discussion of, be frank, not a matter of should we decide to do this. I think we definitely have laid out a pretty compelling kind of scenario where we really need to do this, because I think we need to set some parameters, some frameworks, some benchmarks, some goals, policies, everything that Steve mentioned to get there. So with that said, that's my little pep talk in the beginning I'm jazzed about this, because when you really look at other agencies and you look at their websites and you look at other general plans, you, as a planner, you just have this feeling, oh gosh, this would be great to have all this contextual type of documentation, narrative, slick kind of, documents that kind of go along with our community. I'm looking at it really for something to bring to the community, and where I'm going to touch on here is a little bit about that, which is, it is a community document. Yes, we pull and our decision makers, our leadership, and we bring everybody together, but as I outlined in this update process, I think the two key moments that we will have to get our hands around is appointments of a steering committee as well as a general plan advisory committee. The steering committee more or less acts as kind of a little bit of a check and balance. Initially, they take I think a larger role with our solicitation, what we're trying to achieve, all our kind of administrative kind of teeing up the particular document to get it ready to actually bring in a consultant. And they're somewhat involved in that process as well. That would be kind of a steering committee, an example of what they would achieve. Now, granted, when staff comes to council, we can definitely apply definitions and objectives and parameters around what their role should be. And as I would say this, a general plan advisory committee, nor am I saying that we have to have both of them. I think it's basically a decision that the council collectively would have to make. So a general plan advisory committee is that kind of body that usually is a more sizable group, and it may sometimes, be populated with a council member or two, but then a lot of it is really the stakeholder driven, those particular community members that want to be involved, and everything that moves forward with the document is contained within that particular general plan advisory committee, which I'll touch on when we look at costs, why you may think some of the community elements is a little bit more expensive in general. Well, it's because you have this particular advisory committee. So with that, I kind of definitely went through the process. As I mentioned, we can appoint people, we can bring anybody we want into these various committees and kind of go from there. So I think I touched on both of these without moving through the slide. Lastly, what I would say, the last bullet, it helps shape the update and guides the scope of where we want to be. So these are the two particular committees to highlight. Then we get into what we kind of got the meat and potatoes of where we're headed with, which is a consultant selection, community stakeholder input, and draft policies and updated plan. And so in doing that, in this particular process, it should be pointed out from a land use perspective in the business of planning, where what we typically see is probably about a handful of actual experts in doing general plans. So with that, likely when we do a solicitation, you're going to get individuals that are very seasoned on creating, developing general plans. I think they are very skilled at customizing it to the city's initiatives and also budget as well. But with the budget side of things, I think there's definitely a set point that to get a completed plan, I think you're going to have to pay a certain amount of dollar, but I would say that there's different elements of this particular process where we can jump in as staff to maybe help out with some cost on that. So we would go through a selection. We would put this out as a RFQ and seek out some qualifications. We would receive community and the stakeholder input in reviewing those particular solicitation documents, and then we'd ultimately get into drafting policies, updated the plan, and recommended zoning code amendments. Now, what I'd say, I ripped through that real quick. Well, going through that real quick, I would say going through this process is very tedious. It takes a heavy dose amount of time. There are quite a bit of stakeholder meetings that come out of this, and I think what I can do is highlight a couple of areas that I had an opportunity before jumping in to the meeting to kind of touch on what does it really mean about draft policies and updated plan. For instance, we would develop a policy that would protect, enhance Marysville residents and the community, as an example. Could be a policy. Protect the current small town charm and feel of Marysville. Could be a policy. Recognize the importance of downtown, the community design, as well as economic vitality of that particular area. protect residents from natural and man-made hazards, avoid community risk, and ensure safety, and maintain an appropriate level of public services. So those are a few that I just came up with in looking at this of what would be some policies that would be layered into all those elements that Steve described. Again, it's a long process. Additionally, one of the things that you do have to do is you have to look at existing conditions. That's part of the process when you're doing a general plan. So there'll be a very thorough analysis of community existing conditions. You'll look at the general plan. You'll also look at the zoning, look at basically all the elements that are covered in our current plan. And the consultant would size that up and see where we have shortfalls based on the old plan and based on where we're headed as a community and a group, and marry that up to eventually get to a completed plan. But I think the completion of the existing conditions in light of the fact that we have a very vintage, general plan, I think that exercise probably would be pretty, would probably be pretty quickly, a pretty quick endeavor to get through. So those are kind of, I think, the keys here. And lastly, what I would say is on the community and stakeholder input is, through my experience going through a general plan, is lots and lots of input, lot of feedback from the community. That's what we thrive for when we're doing a general plan update. And that's what we would be doing moving forward. I would say with the steering committees, that would be one of their jobs actually, is to get through that process to help market, to talk about our update and get the word that they're looking for input. In regards to other elements of the process, what we would need to complete would be a fiscal analysis. It's kind of interesting when you really sit back and study Marysville, and I think Steve alluded to growth, and people may sit here and go, well, how are you growing? I mean, we're surrounded by levees, not a lot of vacant land. There's opportunities, I think, to go southward, potentially. So where I'm going with this is that in the general plans that I've had experience working with is they've all been kind of growth communities where there's vacant land, there's greenfield area for development. So the fiscal analysis plays a big role in that, because naturally, as you grow as a community, you have all different elements, public safety, infrastructure, economic development, that all bleeds into what can you support? What's your holding capacity? So I think, in Marysville's case, we do have opportunity to go vertical. There are some sizable vacant parcels to see development, but then there's a greater opportunity to go south, hopefully, and potentially that can come to fruition. So the fiscal analysis will tie that all up together with where we want to go as a community and as we trend towards growing, and it'll basically be kind of that control that says if you add additional 500 rooftops, you better be prepared to provide X amount of officers or a new fire truck or whatever the other elements that come into place. So the fiscal analysis is definitely something that ties in ultimately with the general plan and gives us a little bit of a check as we decide where we want to move forward with. As far as the market analysis, this would be a key component that would look on the economic development activity of this community in the city, especially downtown. It would take a look at our zoning and let us know, do we have the right zoning? Do we have too much of one zoning or not? Too much commercial, maybe too much multifamily on the west side of town, and look at downtown zoning, industrial lands, and it would provide a roadmap of what that sweet spot would be of zoning and what is a good balance to make the city whole and fiscally sound. So that would be another component that we would complete with this process. And then lastly, there's the California Environmental Quality Act, the CEQA component, which would study ultimately the outcome of the general plan and let us know various analyses related to circulation, safety, all the elements, and then come away with various mitigation requirements that the city would need to achieve based on the associated impacts of growth. So for instance, if we decide to go south, likely possible mitigation is going to be something of how does the city provide services to a southern portion of that community when you have a river in between. That's something that I think mitigation will eventually look at safety elements as well as fire and kind of come out with various set mitigation that the city would need to achieve before we actually endeavor into a possible annexation of that area. So that would be a classic kind of example. So the process moving forward would be hearings. Ultimately, when we do get the general plan completed, would naturally go through our planning body, start there. The Planning and Historic Preservation Commission, they're the recommended body. I think, in experience of doing general plan updates, it's numerous meetings with these respective bodies. It's with this Planning Commission and the City Council. There would naturally be a subset after we complete the general plan. It would then tear down to how does the new policies, objectives relate to our zoning ordinance, and I think we all know we do have a definitely a vintage ordinance, and there would be some particular balancing and consistency that we would need to make between a new general plan and our zoning ordinance, so that would also come before the respective bodies based on whatever decision from a land use that we would be bringing forward. So in regards to cost and timeline, I think just in general nature, before I dive in real quick, is I've been around general plan updates that have been, the trend lately, anywhere from 1.4 to close to 1.8, maybe 2 million. These are for larger cities. And a lot has to really do, I don't think size really matters. I think it's just a matter of what you want into your plan and the various elements and what your visions and what you're trying to achieve. So what I would say when it comes to cost, it's this endeavor that we're going to be taking is not an endeavor where if we skin off a certain portion that I think we would, receive a significant, I think, decrease in the cost. And so with that, the next slide outlines three jurisdictions that we reached out to and did a little bit of analysis to look at some cost. Recently, that was our goal, is to look at some recent type of general plans to get some truer numbers. So those were the particular communities, Fountain Valley, Los Gatos, and San Mateo. And with that, we came up with kind of an estimate of 1.1 to 1.5 million dollars of what this endeavor would, I think, cost, with a breakdown of the general plan component with the policies, the goals, objectives in a range of $300,000 to $500,000. As I mentioned earlier, the community engagement is pretty sizable, hence the reason you have a lot of these stakeholder type of meetings and these steering committees, because there are times when you're meeting bi-weekly and maybe 2 to 3 times a month going through this process. So it takes, I think, there is a heavy cost for that. The associated fiscal analysis that I daylighted the market and the economics as well. And then naturally the EIR that would complement this particular document is an added cost of $300,000 to $350,000, and then lastly would be the zoning consistency, and this is what I spoke to regarding seeking consistency between our general plan and our zoning ordinance. What this would entail would be the consultant actually evaluating our zoning ordinance, our zoning ordinance, and providing staff with input of how we make that consistency, and then it ultimately would be a staff-led initiative that we would have this analysis and this matrix that we would follow and actually bring back the various zoning ordinance changes to sync up and complement the general plan. The timeline is pretty accurate, anywhere from 24 to 30 months. I think if you attend league meetings, you may hear stories of general plans taking 4 to 5 years, and there could be that narrative that is out there. I lived sort of through that narrative, and a lot, to me had to do with greenfield development, because a lot of times when cities move forward with a general plan update, cities have these larger size type of projects that seem to, my word, get in the way of the progress you want to make in the plan. And I think, we'll be okay with, not having a sizable type of project, albeit we're working on some things with the hospital. But with that said, I think when you bring development into it, it does kind of suck up a little bit of time. And then I've had experiences where there has been a funding dry up due to the economy. And this last recession that we had actually stalled out one of the documents from moving forward because of budgetary reasons. So it can happen, but we're optimistic because as I go through the slides, here are some funding strategies that I think will hopefully get us to where we want to be, which is first and foremost is SB 2, which is the Building, Housing, and Jobs Act that was recently adopted, I believe, last year. And some of our research and talking with our fellow Council of Government, SACOG, one thing that they did inform us is that the first pot of money going out actually would be for planning vision type of documents. So we're definitely in tune with that. Depending on where we go as a council body and how quickly we move, we may be able to go out and seek a little bit of funding to help out with that, with the funding and general plan. Caltrans, staff has met with Caltrans and talked to Caltrans looking, I would say, for a little bit more of an assist from Caltrans, but what they did offer up is when we get to the safety and circulation type of side of the elements, that they definitely have some key data that they would share with us, which I think, would defray a little bit of the cost when we get into a traffic impact analysis for the city. So I think we'll benefit there. And then, of course, Yuba Water Agency or Yuba County Water Agency, as we know from the past, we've dialogued with their staff and executives, and they're definitely in tune with assisting the city, I think, as most of us know here, in different ways. But this is something that I think is on their mind of our progress of what we make on a general plan. And I think there's I think, connections that we can make with various elements that would funnel into their mission, ultimately. And then ultimately, there's a loan possibility with the agency, and as I highlight here, it can go through, the paid back while we're working on the plan. It also, we could, at any moment, decide we want to do a general plan maintenance fee. What a maintenance fee does is, with any, what I've experienced with any type of new development project, it could be a building application and a permit, or it could be an entitlement. It's really up to the council on guiding us where they would want to go. We could tag the various actions, either entitlement or ministerial, and we could tag those with a particular fee that would help fund portions of the general plan update. And then, lastly, the partnerships, which I think, bleeds into Caltrans as well, and the water agency, and maybe take a loan from them. And then lastly, the general fund, which we have our Measure C and our Measure F, and outstanding, I think as most people know, is the casino MOU that has a pretty sizable dollar amount committed for, my understanding, in perpetuity, I believe. No? Okay. So there's an opportunity to loan against that funding coming in and kind of move this forward to where we want to get some activity going on this particular plan. So with that, that kind of covers the gamut of what a general plan is and where we're headed with council support and direction and approval ultimately. Like I said in the beginning, it's definitely something that, Ms. Brown brought to the table about doing a general plan update, and, I ultimately opened the hood up and I said, yeah, there's kind of a dead end when you really look at our general plan, and I think it's something that the community would benefit greatly from continuing on to see this approved ultimately. So at this point, concludes staff's presentation. We can open up for questions, dialogue. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Let's if there are any questions from council, then I'll open it up for any input from the public, and then I'll finally ask members of the council or the planning commission about their level of support for what's been presented. So staff has an idea on what level of support it has from the council to move ahead, or depending on what type of speed do we want this thing to move forward on. So let's any questions from either planning commissioners or council members? Yes, ma'am.
When do we need to apply, if we wanted to apply for the SB2 grant? That's the, you said you'd have to move quickly on that? What is the
Late spring
deadline for that?
to start of summer. Yeah.
Sir?
On the consultants, with the fact that yourself, Marty, and yourself, Steve, are kind of gurus at this planning and development, what do we specifically get from the consultants that we don't get from you guys?
A lot of their time to start.
Time?
Yes, a lot of their time. I would say a deeper analysis of syncing up the market data as well as in the fiscal component of it to eventually the potential outcome we want to be as a community. That is very vital and important. So they are able to sync that up a lot quicker than staff to complete that exercise. I think, if you, in my experience, I've seen staff do updates as a general plan amendment as not opposed to a general plan update. The trend and where this expertise and complexity falls into those people that actually have that niche market as that type of product.
Just add to that, a comprehensive general plan update like we're talking about is really an enormous undertaking, and I've never observed any city doing it in-house with their own staff. Like Jim said, I've seen an amendment here or there that staff maybe is able to do, but an update of this magnitude like we're talking about, I've never seen in-house staff do that before.
Through the chair.
Yes, sir.
This general plan update is really, really critical because there's opportunities in the state and the federal government. If we don't have our general plan update current, we will not be qualified to apply for them. Also, the severely disadvantaged community in Yuba County, there's two. City of Marysville and Linda, they're the only two. And there are, with the severely disadvantaged community, there are some benefits from being that. It may sound horrible to say we're severely disadvantaged, but in funding, there are some advantages to be that way, whether it be grant writing or whatever. So it's real important that we get started on this thing. This thing meaning this plan, and making sure that we do them as we go progressively along. I think some of them, the transportation element, the housing element, needs to be updated. It doesn't have to be completely rewritten because it's the most current we have in the general plan. As you well know, there's a big push on new housing projects, making sure there's affordable housing. Well, Mr. Schrader and I on the Board of Supervisors made a comment that every house in Yuba County is affordable housing. So that took care of that for a while, but it's raising its head again. So it's important we start on this and we come to consensus of leadership, the Planning and Historical Committee, and the City Council support this and get started, because it's not going to get any better, it's going to get worse. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other questions? Planning commissioners? You have questions? Can you go to the podium, please?
Well, just a few. One of the thing, just through the chair, interesting comment on the general plan that our current one is at a dead end. I was just curious if you could expand on that, or how do we not make it a dead end?
Sure. Where we're at with the general plan is, as Steve alluded to, is it had more or less a sunset on it. it has sunsetted.
Oh, okay, so
Yes.
just the date you're
Yeah, you
implying?
can
Okay.
still continue to make consistency with your general plan, but as Steve laid out, when you look at something as basic as the safety element,
Mm-hmm.
and it just says all we need to do is provide fire, and all we need to provide is police.
So it's
I
just-
think the community would want more than just basically knowing that there's a fire station and there's a PD station next door. I think they would want some objectives that are measurable that can come out of this particular general plan update.
Okay, so it's more about the date.
Correct.
I didn't know if there was something specific in there that, okay, that's one of my questions. And of course, budget-wise, we might not know this because it looks like our funding strategy is, we don't have it defined yet, but I think the big thing, what everybody wants to know is what that's our funding plan, how we're going to pay for it. I know we have the estimated costs. I know, isn't Live Oak is probably our closest one that did a fairly recent general plan update. I think it till 2030. I was just curious if anybody had, I mean, I could look it up, what theirs cost. I was just curious how much it cost. And I have a lot of questions, but mainly I want to just read all this that we got tonight and think about it. I don't know what we're looking for tonight. Are we?
Any questions about their presentation, specific things?
Okay.
I think your question related to comparison with other cities, I think is fair. They share that they compare with 3 other cities. I'm not sure if they necessarily took a look at Live Oak and what their process was.
Okay, and then on the process, the physical analysis, if you could expand on that a little bit more, what that entails.
The fiscal analysis on your presentation?
I mean, I understand the market analysis and the
Fiscal
CEQA, but
analysis.
what that entails what do we analyze for that, for the process?
Yeah, and correct, you did say fiscal, right?
Yes.
Okay,
On
yeah,
this,
yeah, okay, no problem, let me just,
thank you. And one other question, and then I'll sit down.
Let's
'cause-
take one at a time.
Okay.
What does entail the fiscal analysis? And I think you said that had to do with the land use, or I guess the return on the land use, or how much, you know.
sure. So the fiscal analysis really is I think a subset component that ties into a lot of the land use estimates of where we're trending and where we want to go as a community. So if hypothetical, we decided we want to move forward with annexation into south, that fiscal, we as a community and as the steering group and the planning commission and everybody here would need to jump and voice that very loudly so that it can be included in the fiscal analysis. So that way, when we do this update, and if it gets legs eventually in several years, we have that data to know what is the true cost to take on that particular area of the county and bring it into the city. So we'll know about public safety, the costs, we'll know about, fire police. Then we'll know what necessary infrastructure needs to be improved and upgraded. And then if there are vacant lands, which I believe there are, we would then roll into that analysis is what is going to be the cost for infrastructure if we decide we want to develop that vacant land. And that will be rolled into the analysis as well. So then it will provide, my word, did we bite off more than we want to chew? Because realistically, from the duration of this general plan, can we achieve all that, or will we find ourselves not being able to pay for services to the community or provide certain standards of services to the community? So that's what
Okay, thank
goes
you.
into
That's very well explained, thank you. And it sounds like a lot of that's going to come from our workshop and community community input.
correct.
Okay. And my other one's just a short one.
It's okay.
General plan implementation, you talked about general plan policies, grounds for application denial. I was just wondering what application, for application to,
So my recollection of that slide, I don't have that page.
might be,
what we're alluding to there is we as, and the Planning Commission want consistency with the general plan. If we bring forward a particular project that we cannot meet that consistency, then that would be grounds for denying that particular project. So when you look at making consistency under our current plan, you have public, I'm using this as an example, the public safety element, and you only really have, do you have a firehouse, do you have a PD? Yes. It's not very difficult to make the finding that you're consistent, correct? But what we're going into and where we want to go is that when we see a new development project, we believe as a city and the residents and staff that there should be more objectives, qualifiers that we have in our toolkit to say that that is a respectable, well-built, quality type of project. That's what we're getting at. Right now, we are very limited on how we apply consistency because there's not much really to fall back on. Does that explain it?
Yeah, I'm equating it to, because we go by municipal code, probably more so because of our general plan is more outdated, where cities that are having a vibrant development and a plan have a development that is in relation to what their vision is. Say, for example, we're into history, we could come up with general plan where we required, just an example, our general plan would require all buildings, because I know a city that did this, all the new buildings on Main Street had to be brick. And so when you go to that city, it looks like an old-fashioned, but it's actually new development, just an example. I mean,
that would be like, say we have an element, community character or something to that, we would build in what design standards and guidelines, policy statements of what we're trying to achieve. And then when somebody came in with a development project, it would then tier off of what the zoning says naturally, but then you still have to make that consistency with your general plan. And so if somebody wanted to do stucco in that example, we would have the ability to say that's not fitting within our general plan.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to sit down so someone else can
Thank you.
ask. Thank you.
Any other questions from planning commissioners?
Mr. Mayor, Council, good evening. Just a couple things. I wanted to piggyback on Councilmember Simmons' statement. From my background and from where I come from, general plan updating is something that you see in communities. I think probably every, 10 to 15 years is probably realistic. So looking at the age of our general plan is obviously outdated, And I know, socially speaking, things change. People shop differently. They live differently. And from the past, from 1985, looking at how a city or a community might be able to expand is a lot different than how it is now, right? So I'm in agreement with Mr. Simmons. I think it's time, believe it or not, I think it's time to update that. The only question or the only thing that I'd really be concerned or really want to pay attention to is how we can custom tailor with the consultant groups. We don't need to compare ourselves to something like Roseville or Rockland, right? How can we go up and what can we look at? But I think we're on track. I think this is a good thing to move forward with. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll open up to the public. If there's any members of the public who'd like to speak on this matter.
You're not here for this.
Okay, seeing none, I'll close the public comment session. Let's go around, kind of hear from different members, and then we can provide some guidance to the presentations, your thoughts, staff. In my mind, depending on our level of commitment, I think they can start running on this and move forward and try to find funding and put together committees and put together the steering committee. But let's hear from, what are the thoughts from council members? So, Vice Mayor.
I think I agree with Mr. Belz. I think it is high time to update the general plan, and I know we've even run into it recently, issues about our sign ordinances, our we can't really update or change. It's not recommended by staff to do that unless we really have a picture of what we want our city to look like. So that one little detail falls into that big category of we need to update the plan. So yeah, I think we should move ahead with it, and I think it's a great presentation, very informational and educational, so yeah, I say let's go for it.
Thank you. Councilmember Hudson.
Well, I appreciate the information. I wasn't quite aware of the vintage of the old plan. I do
If it
believe
was
that,
wine, it would be good. Maybe.
I do believe that it would be good to update it. I'm a little concerned about the funding resources, as general. As well as I don't want to lose the feel of Marysville, and so forth. And what we once were and what we can be again are two different things. So as long as we remember the history and think about the future, I think it's a good plan.
Thank you. Councilmember Simmons?
Yeah, I think an interesting thing is the plan is so outdated, but we got a controversy coming right now. It's called the circulation of Marysville. Got this Highway 70 program going on, and we're right in the middle of it. We don't know where we're going to go. Our general plan doesn't give us much information on how to do this, and it's impacting the quality of life as well as the economic development of the city of Marysville. So that's why this is so important to get this done and make sure that the ordinances aren't driving it, but the general plan is driving it. Right now, we're driving the city government by ordinances and laws that were voted in by the city council. The general plan will help offset that. You can say, okay, paragraph 492 of the general plan says we can't do this, and you can't because it's been adopted. So yes, we need to move on with this. Time is a waste, and 2 years will be up before you know it. Thank you, Mayor.
Councilmember Baracaboli?
Obviously, it's something I think we need to do, but I'm with Councilman Hudson. Until we can, one, define the funding a little better that we think we're going to be able to get. We're pretty much speculation right now. And securing that funding, one of the suggestions in here was Measure C, but if I'm not mistaken, we've already spent Measure C, or fit it into our budget, so it doesn't seem like much of an option. But without a doubt, it's something we need to do, but we can't do anything until we define that funding a little better and secure some of that funding.
Thank you. I guess, I think we're in agreement that it needs to happen. I agree that we need to move forward and identify what that funding is. Really, I'm not too worried about the funding. I believe the funding will whether we move forward on borrowing the money and financing this plan, or whether we find partial funding and then partial financing it through a loan. I imagine that there's a lot of folks that want us to move forward on this for many reasons. I was talking, we were at Beale the other day, and unfortunately, folks don't see us as a option to live or to do business. They end up going to Lincoln or Roseville and other places for housing or to do business or to start their operations over there. But we're a lot closer. So I think part of the general plan, we'll take a look at all those circumstances, all those positives that we have, and we need to be able to say, that's who we want to be as a community, and the community inputs can be very important so we can come up with some type of community-involved agreement on where the community wants to be, who they want to be in the next 10, 15 years and 20 years, so then we can be an option for Beale Air Force Base as they're getting new missions, as they're increasing their population over there, as they're needing new housing, as they're needing new office space. We should be that choice. And we need to grow, and I think the county and us need to have a really serious conversation about the level of services that they currently have in the south of Yuba County, and are we an option to provide those services, and how are we going to be able to grow enough to pay for those things? We need to have this discussion. We need to have it as soon as possible. The general plan will allow us to have a lot of those discussions, not only with our partners, with Beale, with the county, but with the entire folks that live here, that work here, that want to improve their lives here, that want to raise a family here. We have a beautiful, wonderful city, but we haven't had a vision since 1985, and that's outdated. I don't think we should call it vintage, we should just call it dead. We should have a vision that we can all agree on how we want to see Marysville grow. So I'm totally supportive with staff moving forward. I think everyone here is moving forward. I think there is that question about how do we pay for it. I really believe that we can come up with those dollars as we move forward with our goal setting in the next few weeks and put together our budget for the next week. 2 weeks ago, or 2 meetings ago, we had a great session about our fiscal house, and we have now tools that we'll be able to use to kind of put together models on how we'll be able to fund different things. So this should be, or how we put away monies. We have $2.5 million that haven't been spent in our budget. How much of that should go to this? In our one time, those are the things that we need to start thinking about. How do we use some of those dollars that we haven't spent? So I think we're in agreement that we want this to happen. I think it is a question of how we pay for it. And I think those conversations could be had as we move forward. Yes, sir.
Mr. Mayor, I'm in agreement with most of what you're saying. But when you talk about loans are the way that we can secure payment for
Could
this.
be.
The thing, I agree with you, but what our interest needs to also be is how do we pay those loans back?
Yep.
It's not securing the loans, we can probably do.
Yeah.
So my whole thing is gonna be pushing in this is just making sure
It's fiscally.
that whatever funding we can get, that we're able to generate or have a way that we pay it back, in a reasonable amount of time, that we don't end up with another antique plan and haven't even paid for it yet.
Absolutely. Thank you. Let's, Simmons and then Vice Mayor.
Just a question of procedure. May I go ask Jim through the chair? Jim, we don't have to take this plan on at all at 7 elements at once. Can they be sectioned out? I know you don't want to do that, but talking about, I got a physical monitor here, and I'm trying to figure.
You should, I think we should tackle the main elements. One thing that you have to be concerned with in segmenting is that you do have to complete an environmental analysis, so some of the findings and objectives and goals and policies could become inconsistent with where we want to be from an environmental when they do the analysis. So what I've seen, example, when that condition of this agency put the process on hold, they then required a double cost of the environmental analysis because we had to go back and look at what was completed to date, and then they had to mirror that up with new changes in laws and land use and the state Senate bills and Assembly bills that get adopted. So albeit, it seems a little prudent, I see that, but I think, going that road, I think would cost us a little bit more in the long run.
Well, I was referring to some of the smaller, like safety, fire and protection, and police. That's not a big issue, really, for the general plan. However, fire is, because as we know, remember the briefing we got last week was that the fire station needs to be moved because it's right next to a gas line. So, but those are types of things, environmental, I understand that. But if you can't come up to 1.1 to 1.5 million dollars to do this plan at once, and you have to go out on a loan, and we don't have the resources to pay that loan back, it could be another B Street property, and I definitely don't want that to happen.
I think the elements are definitely all woven and with each other, so just using the safety and putting that maybe on a hold. Well, when you get to the market analysis of the services that you need to provide, then you see where we may end up where we don't have that data, and we need to know that if we want to pursue something like an annexation. So that could happen.
Well, thank you so much. That was in the back of my mind if we partial it out, but thank you, Mayor.
Vice Mayor?
Yes, Marty Brown was talking about the different elements that we had, like the circulation element. Caltrans was going to contribute with data, right, to help us with the part of the cost of that. the health element, possibly the hospital might want to contribute. So there might be other community partners that would contribute to this, as far Cal Water as well, or not Cal Water, but the water agency. Do you want to talk about the other possibilities?
Yeah, I just briefly, I just would say that, that I think if the council was inclined and the community inclined to add additional optional elements, that I think that there are some other partners out there that would be interested. I think the hospital might be interested in a community health element, as you stated, a water resources element. I mean, given where we are at the confluence of two rivers, there's lots of reasons why that could make sense in terms of addressing water resources for the city. In that regard, I could see possibly the YWA might be interested in a grant versus a loan for something like that. So I think and Caltrans has already stated that they would be more than willing to give us and provide a lot of fairly up-to-date, engineering traffic data. And there may be a grant that they have that would qualify for the circulation element. I mean, that's all about timing, though. If we hang out and we wait for too many grants to do it, it could sort of take too long. So those are, timing would be something we'd want to look at. But it is possible that there are other granting institutions like that would maybe, Jim and I have talked about this several times, peeling off different elements that they might be just interested in specific ones, and I think that's something we can look at. But again, my concern is the timing of applying for lots of different grants, and then you're hanging out and waiting for money.
Right.
So you just kind of have to weigh all that.
So, and these wouldn't be the main portion of the general plan update, they were just, okay.
No,
so
the main ones are the ones
okay,
that Jim
so we
talked
need-
about, the 7 ones, those are
Right.
required under state law. We absolutely
Okay.
have to, if we're gonna do an update, you have to do those 7.
Right.
These other ones would be optional ones that I only thought of is if other partners wanted to, come to the table and there was an interest on the part of the council in some of these additional elements.
Okay, so that wouldn't have to do with that central part that we need to do. So we need to have our own funding plan for that. Okay, all right, thank you.
Any other comments? Well, thank you, staff, and thank you for the planning commission for being here. I appreciate you guys taking the time to be part of this. It's important for you to be part of it. As you heard, you'll be part of the review and actively participating and putting together a plan for this. I think staff should heard that council is interested in moving forward, but we want to be very clear that we want to take a look at the finance of it and where that money is coming from, so everyone feels comfortable in moving forward. Okay, I'm going to take a 3-minute bathroom break, and then we'll come back to our general meeting.